The next Java API for managing tasks and threads at a higher level is the executor service. This is something that's kind of like the go-to these days when you're working with Java threads. You don't typically run a new thread anymore. You just use the executor service for the most part. And there's a good reason for it. This service comes with a lot of benefits. But before we get into the benefits, let's look at the motivation for the executor service itself. So first of all, it's a high-level API for executing tasks. And it is going to do a lot of things that you would have otherwise had to do when you're creating task instances, managing it, and all that stuff. The problem is that creating new threads is resource intensive. Anytime you say a new thread and then you assign it a runnable, you start it, it's like it takes a lot of time and resources. It's not trivial. Something we have to think about in general when you're doing concurrent programming. Yes, you want to use multiple cores, you want to split your work, but then you're paying a cost here. The cost is the creation of thread instances. Right? This is not just for Java. Any software platform API which supports the creation of threads, you have to pay the cost, right? So a typical solution to this is to just reuse threads, right? So you have created a thread and then you are done with it. Well, rather than have to create a new thread instance to do something else, you can reuse the thread instance and say, hey, this previous work was done. Now the same thread instance here is your new runnable. You execute this. When you're done, I'm going to reuse that same thread instance for multiple other things to be done. All right. So this is again very common, and this is typically done in many software platforms using something called a thread pool. So thread pool is a fixed number of thread instances that get created in the beginning. And then when tasks come in that need to be done, a new thread instance is picked from that pool of threads, and that thread instance gets to do the work. Another task comes in the meantime, another instance of the thread is picked from the thread pool, it does the work, and so on. When all the threads in that thread pool are busy, well, other tasks have to wait, other runnables have to wait. When something gets done, that instance goes back into the thread pool, and then that instance is again picked for the next piece of work to be done. So it serves a bunch of purposes. One, you don't have to keep creating new instances of thread every time, right? This is kind of like you get to reuse it. And secondly, you have control over the number of thread instances, right? You don't want to just create a new thread instance every time, and you don't have control over how many thread instances are created. You might run out of memory because of creating way too many thread objects. So this kind of establishes that control and also reuses thread instances, which are both beneficial. So you can create thread pools by managing thread instances yourself. So you can say, I want to create a new thread instance, manage it in an array list or whatever, and do all that work. But there is a better way, and that is by using an executor service. Java comes with an executor service, which allows you to manage thread pools, for example. And the main purpose of the executor service is to say, hey, I'm going to take care of executing your runnables. What you need to do is configure me and say what kind of mode you want to run, and give me your runnables and I will run it. That's what the executor service does. So there are a bunch of different implementations of the executor service, but in general, what they do is they manage your runnables or tasks for you. I'm going to refer to them as tasks for a particular reason, and it will become clear why in a little bit. It manages your runnables or tasks for you, right? You basically give it your runnable and say, hey, executor service, run this runnable for me, and then it's going to run it. It also provides these additional abilities like creating a thread pool. You say, hey, I want an executor service which has a thread pool of 10 threads. And the executor service is going to manage the creation of a thread instance whenever it wants. All you're doing is saying, hey, executor service, run this runnable. And the executor service is going to take care of like which thread instance needs to be picked, what needs to run, how many thread instances are allocated. All that stuff is managed by the executor service. And then finally, it also enables results, which is a new thing with Java 5 onwards. The basic classic thread APIs don't enable results. You can't have a thread do something and then return a value. Runnable is a one-way task. You can only give it something and say, hey, go execute it. But with the new APIs and the new paradigms, you can have a task or a thread return a value when that thread is done. And you can leverage that using these new APIs. And I'll cover how to do that. So these are higher level APIs in the Java 5 onwards. And again, like I said, these days, if you're trying to create threads in Java, you should be using the executor service rather than creating new threads yourself.